It was the bitter cold of November 1939 when the world watched in disbelief as the Soviet Union launched a sudden invasion of Finland, igniting what would become known as the Winter War. For a nation that had only gained independence barely 2 decades earlier, the shock was profound. Finland, carved from centuries of Russian influence and Scandinavian ties, was a small country of rugged landscapes, frozen lakes, and dense forests, but its people were fiercely independent, hardened by history, and bound together by a sense of survival. Yet, in the face of the Red Army, an industrial behemoth armed with tanks, artillery, and overwhelming manpower, the odds seemed impossible. The story of Finland's desperate struggle to negotiate peace with the USSR did not begin with negotiations. It began with this unprovoked storm of fire, ice, and human resilience. The roots of the conflict traced back long before the first gunfire echoed across the Finnish frontier. After the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, Finland seized the moment to declare independence. The fledgling nation navigated civil unrest and the pressures of establishing borders in a tumultuous post-World War I Europe, eventually securing recognition of its sovereignty. Yet the Soviet Union, emerging from revolution and civil war, remained suspicious of Finland's autonomy. The strategic location of Finland, directly bordering Leningrad, was of immense importance to Soviet security planners. They feared the presence of German influence in the region and sought to establish a buffer zone to protect the city from potential attack. Negotiations over territory, particularly the Karelian Isthmus and islands in the Gulf of Finland, had failed repeatedly, and Stalin's patience thinned, replaced by the inexorable machinery of war. When the Red Army crossed the Finnish border, the scale of the challenge became immediately apparent. Finland's army was small, poorly equipped, and vastly outnumbered, but what it lacked in numbers, it compensated for in ingenuity and determination. Finnish soldiers, many of them farmers and loggers, adapted to the winter landscape with extraordinary skill. Using skis to navigate the snow-covered forests, employing guerrilla tactics, and striking supply lines with surgical precision, they turned their homeland into a deadly arena for the Soviet advance. The world looked on, astonished, as these modest forces inflicted heavy casualties on an army that had seemed invincible on paper. Newsreels and newspapers around the globe painted images of Finnish defenders braving sub-zero temperatures, setting ambushes, and slipping silently through snow-laden woods to strike armored columns and mechanized units with an effectiveness that defied expectations. Yet the Winter War was not merely a tale of battlefield heroics. It was a story of human suffering, civilian resilience, and the harsh realities of geopolitics. Cities along the front line faced bombardment and destruction. Refugees fled the advancing Soviet forces, carrying what little they could salvage from homes and farms. Food shortages and harsh winters compounded the misery, yet the Finnish population, united by a deep sense of national identity, endured. The government, led by President Kyösti Kallio and Prime Minister Risto Ryti, balanced the need to maintain morale with the imperative to manage an increasingly unsustainable military campaign. Diplomacy was attempted, but Finland's isolation on the international stage, coupled with the reluctance of other nations to confront Stalin, left its leaders with little leverage. They faced the grim reality that survival, rather than victory, might be the only achievable outcome. Despite the devastating pressure, Finnish resistance had an unexpected impact on world opinion. Newspapers in London, Paris, and New York chronicled the courage and ingenuity of the little nation that could, framing the conflict as a David versus Goliath struggle. Volunteer aid, monetary support, and symbolic gestures came from around the globe, yet practical military assistance was limited. For Finland, the battle was as much about maintaining national dignity as it was about territorial defense. Each day of resistance, each repelled assault, became a bargaining chip, a demonstration that the Soviet Union could not easily subjugate the Finnish people. The courage displayed on frozen lakes and forested hills became an unspoken argument in the background of peace negotiations that would inevitably follow. By March 1940, the harsh reality of numerical and material disparity could no longer be ignored. The Soviets had learned from initial failures, adapting tactics, increasing artillery bombardment, and exploiting logistical advantages. Finnish leaders, despite extraordinary courage, recognized that continued resistance risked total destruction. Thus, negotiations moved from the realm of theory to necessity. In Moscow, Finnish representatives engaged in tense discussions with Soviet officials, navigating a labyrinth of demands that sought to secure territorial concessions, military restrictions, and a realignment of Finland's foreign policy in accordance with Soviet strategic needs. The atmosphere was fraught, any misstep could be interpreted as defiance, yet any acquiescence risked the perception of weakness among the Finnish population. The resulting Moscow Peace Treaty, signed on March 12, 1940, marked the end of the Winter War but left a deep scar on the Finnish psyche. Finland ceded roughly 11% of its territory, including the vital Karelia region, areas that held not only strategic significance but also deep cultural and economic value. The loss of homes, farms, and cities displaced over 400,000 people, forcing a mass resettlement and the challenging integration of refugees into the remaining territories. For the Soviet Union, the treaty represented a diplomatic success, achieving security objectives without enduring prolonged international scrutiny or catastrophic losses. Yet for Finland, it was both a relief and a bitter pill, a survival triumph shadowed by the knowledge that sovereignty had been preserved at the cost of significant national sacrifice. The aftermath of the Winter War revealed the complexity of small nation diplomacy in a world dominated by great powers. Finland's leaders had demonstrated remarkable skill in balancing military resistance with pragmatic negotiation. The concessions made were significant, but the country had retained independence, an outcome few had anticipated when Soviet tanks first crossed the border. International observers noted that the Finnish example illustrated how tenacity, strategic acumen, and a profound understanding of one's own limitations could shape outcomes even in the shadow of overwhelming force. For historians, diplomats, and military scholars, the Winter War became a case study in resilience, national identity, and the delicate art of negotiating peace from a position of relative weakness. The lessons of 1939 to 1940 were not lost on Finnish society. The memory of the Winter War remained vivid, etched into the national consciousness as a reminder of vulnerability, courage, and the ever-present necessity of prudent diplomacy. As Europe plunged deeper into the conflagration of World War II, Finland's leaders prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, aware that the fragile peace with the Soviet Union could be tested again. The war had proven that even a small nation could resist a giant, yet it had also underscored the limits of resistance and the importance of negotiation, compromise, and timing. The stage was set for the next chapter in Finland's struggle, a delicate balancing act between reclaiming lost territories, preserving sovereignty, and navigating the treacherous currents of global conflict. Shadows of occupation and the path to continuation. The fragile calm that followed the Moscow Peace Treaty in March 1940 settled uneasily over Finland. Though the guns had fallen silent, the shadow of the Soviet threat lingered, a constant reminder that survival in the Baltic region required vigilance, strategy, and, above all, adaptability. Finland had preserved its independence, but the loss of Karelia and other territories was more than a territorial setback. It was a wound in the national psyche, a lingering question about what compromises were necessary to secure sovereignty against a powerful neighbor. The following months and years were marked by both reconstruction and subtle preparation, as the country braced for a future in which neutrality alone might not guarantee safety. The interwar years between the Winter War and the Continuation War were a period of intense political and military recalibration. Finnish leaders understood that the Soviet Union had not forgotten the humiliation of resistance, nor the weaknesses revealed in the battlefield. Internationally, Finland was in a precarious position. The League of Nations had condemned the Soviet invasion, granting Finland moral support but offering minimal practical military assistance. Europe was shifting rapidly. Germany's ambitions in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe were becoming more explicit, and the looming specter of the broader Second World War forced Finland to consider alliances not merely as options, but as necessities. The Finnish government sought to maintain diplomatic flexibility, understanding that the nation's survival depended on careful maneuvering between two great powers, the USSR to the east and Germany to the west. Economic recovery and military restructuring became intertwined priorities. The loss of Karelia had displaced hundreds of thousands of Finns, and the resettlement process strained resources and social cohesion. Simultaneously, Finnish military strategists undertook a thorough review of tactics, equipment, and defense infrastructure. Lessons from the Winter War were dissected in meticulous detail: the effectiveness of ski troops, the vulnerability of conventional lines to guerrilla-style assaults, and the critical importance of terrain knowledge. New training programs emphasized mobility, camouflage, and defensive fortifications designed to exploit the country's dense forests and frozen landscapes. While the nation outwardly presented an image of cautious normalcy, beneath the surface a quiet determination simmered. Finland would not be caught unprepared a second time. Diplomatic contacts during this period were equally strategic. Finnish officials monitored the growing tension between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, evaluating how Finland might leverage German aggression to regain lost territories without surrendering its sovereignty. Intelligence gathering increased, focusing on Soviet troop movements, industrial capacity, and political intentions. Finnish leaders recognized that any opportunity to reclaim Karelia or assert their territorial claims would likely come through alignment with powers opposed to Moscow, though they remained wary of fully committing to any external military alliance. The balancing act was delicate. Finland needed assistance to defend itself and reclaim lost lands, but it could not risk becoming a pawn in a larger ideological or territorial conflict. The summer of 1941 brought the turning point. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, and Finland found itself in a position where action could no longer be postponed. The circumstances were complex. Finnish leaders were not driven solely by alliance with Germany, nor by ideological alignment with the Nazis, but by the strategic necessity of reclaiming territory lost in the Winter War. The Continuation War began as a calculated decision to coordinate with Germany against a common adversary, the Soviet Union, while asserting that Finland's war aims were strictly national and defensive in nature. The timing was critical. Soviet forces were concentrated on multiple fronts, and Finnish planners saw an opening to regain Karelia, secure the northern border, and strengthen Finland's bargaining position in any future peace talks. As German troops advanced through the Baltic region, Finnish forces mobilized with precision. The army had grown in size and sophistication, integrating lessons learned from previous campaigns. Logistics, intelligence, and local knowledge were leveraged to maximize effectiveness despite limited resources. Finnish forces advanced alongside German units, carefully coordinating movements to reclaim lost towns, forests, and strategic positions, while maintaining a clear distinction between Finnish national objectives and German broader ambitions. This distinction would prove essential in post-war diplomacy, as Finland sought to demonstrate that its cooperation with Germany was opportunistic rather than ideological, a necessary strategy for survival in the volatile theater of Eastern Europe. The opening months of the continuation war were marked by rapid movement and cautious optimism. Finnish troops recaptured much of Karelia, pushing the front lines to positions that echoed pre-Winter War borders. Cities like Aepuri were retaken, symbolizing both military achievement and national morale. Yet alongside victories came immediate challenges: securing supply lines, integrating reclaimed territories, and managing civilian populations traumatized by years of conflict and displacement. Finnish planners recognized that military gains alone would not secure long-term security. Diplomatic foresight and negotiation would be equally vital. Every captured town, every defensive line, was simultaneously a bargaining chip in the broader strategy of ensuring that Finland could negotiate peace on terms that preserved sovereignty and minimized Soviet reprisal. The human dimension of this period cannot be overlooked. Soldiers endured harsh conditions, extreme weather, and the psychological strain of fighting alongside a powerful ally while confronting a familiar enemy. Civilians in recaptured territories faced both relief and uncertainty, returning to homes devastated by war and preparing for the uncertainties of the months to come. Finland's government, aware of the delicate balance between military necessity and civilian welfare, implemented measures to stabilize food supplies, restore infrastructure, and communicate strategic objectives. Public morale was carefully nurtured, emphasizing national unity, the legitimacy of war aims, and the ultimate goal of securing Finland's independence. This dual approach, military coordination with Germany and careful attention to domestic stability, would define Finland's strategy throughout the continuation war. As 1941 progressed, Finland's alignment with Germany became increasingly pragmatic. While German forces focused on advancing deep into Soviet territory, Finnish operations remained primarily defensive and territorial. The Finnish government emphasized that its objectives were bounded: reclaiming lost lands, protecting borders, and ensuring that the Soviet threat could be managed through strategic negotiation rather than permanent occupation. This careful framing would later prove crucial when the tides of war shifted, enabling Finland to negotiate peace with the USSR from a position that balanced military leverage with political prudence. By the end of the first year of the continuation war, Finland had achieved significant territorial recovery and strengthened its military posture. Yet beneath the surface, the challenges of prolonged conflict, the unpredictability of German fortunes, and the ever-present Soviet threat loomed large. The nation had regained much, but true security and peace would require more than battlefield victories. It would require diplomacy, foresight, and the capacity to navigate the treacherous waters of great power politics. The stage was set for the next, and perhaps most delicate, chapter in Finland's wartime saga: the negotiation of peace with the Soviet Union, a task that would test the limits of strategic acumen, national resolve, and the lessons learned from both the Winter War and the opening campaigns of the continuation war. The tide turns: strain and survival. By the early months of 1942, the initial optimism that had buoyed Finland during the early stages of the continuation war had begun to give way to the harsh realities of prolonged conflict. The Finnish military had regained much of the territory lost during the Winter War, including the culturally and strategically significant regions of Karelia, yet the war had revealed a sobering truth: aligning with Germany against the Soviet Union carried risks that extended far beyond the battlefield. While German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory, Finnish leaders remained cautious, focused on securing their regained lands and preserving national sovereignty. The country's limited resources, small population, and harsh northern climate meant that every operational decision had consequences far beyond immediate tactical outcomes. As 1942 unfolded, the Soviet Union began to recalibrate its military strategy. Having absorbed the shock of Germany's initial invasion, the Red Army gradually reorganized, retrained, and re-equipped its forces. A series of counter-offensives on the Leningrad front, combined with increasingly effective artillery and air power, signaled to Finnish commanders that the window for easy victories had closed. Intelligence reports indicated that the Soviet Union was committing significant manpower and materiel to the northwestern sector, and the likelihood of a direct confrontation threatening Finnish-controlled territory was growing. Behind the scenes, Finnish diplomats monitored these developments with mounting concern, understanding that military success alone could not guarantee long-term security if the Soviets regained the initiative. The strain on Finland's economy and civilian population became increasingly visible. Wartime taxation, conscription, and resource allocation placed enormous pressure on families, particularly in northern regions where food shortages were compounded by the harsh winters. Civilians in recaptured territories faced reconstruction challenges. Towns devastated by both previous Soviet occupation and ongoing military operations required rebuilding, while the resettlement of displaced populations from the Winter War remained incomplete. Finnish authorities worked tirelessly to maintain morale, using propaganda and public communications to emphasize unity, perseverance, and the righteousness of national objectives. Yet beneath the surface, fatigue and anxiety were growing, both among the military and civilian sectors, foreshadowing the difficult decisions that would soon confront the nation. In 1943, as the tide of war began to shift more broadly in the east, Finnish leaders faced a strategic dilemma. Continued alignment with Germany offered potential advantages in territorial security and bargaining leverage, but it also risked drawing Finland into increasingly dangerous military engagements that could jeopardize the nation's sovereignty. Soviet counterattacks, though initially cautious, began probing Finnish positions along the Karelian Isthmus and the northern sectors. These skirmishes tested Finland's defensive preparations, revealing vulnerabilities in logistics, troop rotation, and winter warfare readiness. The Finnish military responded with disciplined defensive operations, leveraging terrain and mobility to blunt Soviet advances. Yet each engagement exacted a human cost, further straining the country's capacity for sustained resistance. The political dimension of the war became increasingly complex. Finnish diplomats recognized that international developments, particularly the progress of the Allies in other theaters of World War II, would shape the post-war environment. Maintaining the perception that Finland's war objectives were limited and defensive became crucial, not merely for domestic support but also for future negotiations with the Soviet Union and the broader international community. Finnish leaders sought to demonstrate that cooperation with Germany was tactical and pragmatic, emphasizing that their alliance was conditional and bounded by national priorities. This framing would later prove essential in the delicate task of negotiating peace without succumbing to punitive occupation or losing the independence that Finland had fought so hard to preserve. By late 1943, the situation became increasingly precarious. The Soviet Union's mounting successes in Stalingrad and elsewhere underscored the growing imbalance in military momentum. Finnish commanders and political leaders recognized that continued conflict, if prolonged, could lead to devastating losses. The realization that a negotiated settlement might be preferable to outright defeat gained traction. Covert diplomatic channels began exploring the possibility of initiating talks with the Soviet Union, assessing which concessions might secure peace without compromising national sovereignty. These discussions were fraught with uncertainty, any premature overture risked being perceived as weakness, yet delaying too long risked allowing the Red Army to dictate terms from a position of overwhelming strength. The winter of 1943 to 1944 intensified both the human and strategic pressures. Finnish troops faced not only the harsh climate but also the psychological toll of a war that, though limited in scope compared to other theaters, was relentless in its demands. Supply chains were stretched thin, artillery and ammunition reserves required careful rationing, and every decision carried long-term implications for civilian welfare and military viability. Meanwhile, Soviet forces continued probing Finnish lines, conducting reconnaissance and occasional offensives designed to test defensive capabilities. The combination of external pressure and internal strain created a sense of urgency among Finnish leaders. Survival depended on preparation for both military defense and the complex negotiations that would soon define the nation's future. In the summer of 1944, the Red Army launched a significant offensive across the Karelian Isthmus, demonstrating both numerical superiority and strategic coordination. Finnish forces, though resilient, were pushed back in critical sectors, signaling a clear shift in the balance of power. The prospect of protracted combat against a revitalized and increasingly assertive Soviet military compelled Finland to prioritize negotiation over continued engagement. Finnish leaders understood that delaying peace could result in occupation, further territorial loss, and potential subjugation of their political institutions. The calculus was stark: concessions would be necessary, but with careful strategy, the nation could preserve its independence and limit the human and material toll. Preparations for formal peace talks accelerated in the latter half of 1944. Finland's diplomatic corps engaged in careful communications with Soviet counterparts, exploring acceptable terms while safeguarding national interests. The discussions were highly sensitive, requiring discretion and precision. Every misstep could provoke renewed hostilities or undermine domestic confidence. Finnish negotiators leveraged both military positioning and strategic patience, recognizing that the Soviet Union's objectives were as much about security and political influence as territorial expansion. The goal was clear: achieve an armistice that would end active combat, preserve sovereignty, and establish conditions conducive to long-term stability. By September 1944, the situation reached a critical juncture. The Soviet Union, confident in its military dominance, was prepared to dictate terms, but Finland's disciplined negotiation and prior military successes provided leverage. Finnish representatives, operating under strict instructions, approached the table with the dual aim of securing peace and demonstrating that Finland's wartime conduct had been guided by defensive necessity rather than aggression. The stage was set for a delicate balancing act, in which Finland's survival depended on the ability to navigate complex military, political, and psychological dimensions, an act of statecraft that would determine the nation's post-war trajectory. Thus, by the